it's easy to get everybody to agree to like an innocuous kind of well-designed but not anything out of the ordinary approach. But doing something that feels really different, I think is quite challenging to get everybody on the same page for that.
Welcome to the program, Chris.
Thank you.
So for those who don't know, Chris Allen is a self-taught graphic designer from New Hampshire whose work maximizes clarity while remaining highly visually engaging. The aesthetic simplicity of his work has caught the attention of tastemakers like Apple, Google, and Tesla, among a very long list of clients that he's contributed to. And when I say it's a long list, I truly mean it. And Chris's work to me is a melding of some of the design philosophies of someone like Dieter Rams, who emphasizes functionality, sort of utility, and sleekness, as well as that meeting with someone like Paula Scher, who emphasizes expressiveness. And so the way that I came into contact with Chris was, well, I was in my graduate design program in California, and I was scraping by trying to make ends meet in LA. I was looking for any work I could, and a colleague of mine who I worked with at Good Counsel, who I'll name drop, Ben V. Shout out to Ben V. He's been very good to me, giving me work over the years. He reached out to me one day and said, "Hey, I have a project I'd love for you to jump on." So while I was onboarding with Ben, he sent me this Figma file, and so I just thought it was like another ordinary day, jump into the Figma, and I opened up this file, and not only was the work inside of it super strong, but I've never seen a more structured, organized, labeled document in my life. And so even before asking the questions like relevant to the project I was working on, the first question I had was, who made this work? And Ben at the time got onboarded after the initial work was done. So he's like, man, like I can't put you in touch with them, but just seeing from the edits, it's this guy, Chris Allen. And so I kind of did my own digging and tracked him down on, I think it was LinkedIn. And Chris, and that was about 6 months ago, and Chris has been very generous, sort of helping me out, giving me feedback on my work, critiquing my work. And I'm happy to call him a friend, so very excited to have him on the program. And so I'll jump into some questions I have, and I'll let Chris take the floor. When I first tracked you down, I noticed on your LinkedIn that you didn't study design formally and you went to business school for your undergrad education. So I'm curious how you got into practicing design, coming from sort of like the untraditional path of going to school for it.
Yeah. So in terms of a choice of what I would study in college, I would say I didn't think about it too much. I kind of just followed the path of what the rest of my family did. So both my parents went to business school, my brother went to business school, and I kind of looked at that as, okay, this is the like most direct path to just being employed and having a job and not having to worry about how I was going to make a career of something. In hindsight, probably could have benefited from thinking through a little bit more about that one. But yeah, so I knew I was interested in design always from kind of like middle school. I was really interested, like Apple products were the first introduction for me of something where I felt, okay, this is like very thoughtfully made, and I like all the decisions that went into this to make it so thoughtfully designed. So that was kind of my first exposure to like, okay, design as a realm, that's cool. I'm interested in this. And then in high school, I worked on the school newspaper. That was like Adobe PageMaker, Quark, all these early design tools before I was using the Creative Suite and really enjoying kind of layout and composition and being able to mess with the way that type was set. So doing that in high school was kind of my initial exposure to it. I helped my dad needed a logo for a small business he was starting. So he got me the Adobe Creative Suite and said, if you can make me a logo for my business, then I'll get you the software. I was like, all right, deal. Because at the time I remember thinking this is way too expensive to actually buy. I was mowing lawns and stuff. I'm like, I'm not going to save up enough money to get the Pro Tools. So getting that was kind of gave me a head start on practicing and being able to spend free time doing that. And then in college, I worked at the college newspaper for like the student events organization. I made posters and stuff. So it was something where I was always doing on the side, but studying marketing and being in like accounting class or something about analytics or what, I just had no real interest in it. I just figured this is needed to get a degree. But at the same time, I was really enjoying doing design work outside of that. So after school, realizing that this had a potential to be a career, which I hadn't previously thought about, I got more excited about, okay, I can definitely start at one place, develop a skill set in a certain area, and then expand from there. I just saw other people kind of being a generalist, doing a bunch of different types of projects. And that was pretty inspiring. So I think that was kind of my main goal was just, this is really interesting and something I enjoy. Can I make a career of this? And then once I realized it was viable, it was off and running from there.
Nice. And so when you were in those accounting and analytics classes, I know that you were practicing design, but I'm curious at that point in time, what was your understanding of sort of the industry of design?
Yeah, I didn't know anything. I didn't know any like famous designers. I had never heard of Paul Rand or Milton Glaser or anybody famous in the design realm. I guess the only person I'd probably heard of was Johnny Ive, watching those product videos and hearing him talk in a delightful accent about how thoughtfully the products were made. So, like I said, yeah, when I was younger, just being an Apple fanboy, I always thought, okay, that's like the pinnacle of design. And then in terms of graphic design and knowing kind of that the history of that and how the industry works, how advertising works. Yeah, advertising. I'd probably seen Mad Men. That was my only exposure to what the ad world might be like. So, with all of these things, I was pretty green to it and had no real experience with how that works. But I did find it intriguing, and I always thought, a good advert. I remember seeing like old Volkswagen ads for like the original Beetle and that stuff, and I thought, okay, this is pretty cool. Whoever came up with this was clever, and so I had those bits and pieces of things I liked, but I didn't know anything about the industry or how this stuff actually works.
Cool. And then, so I guess fast forward, sort of like a full circle moment, you've had the opportunity to do some work for Apple. And alongside that, you've worked for many other companies, a couple which I named, Google and Tesla, but along with agencies like Ogilvy. And so it seems from an outside that you've had a big range of sort of different modes of working. You've done sort of like the in-house at a big company. You've also done the agency route along with the freelance work you're doing now. I'm curious, how would you sort of do the pros and cons for some of these different formats? And was it intentional to sort of explore the different kinds of modes of working, or was it all natural?
Yeah. So one like easy pro and con to get out of the way is pay, like tech companies paying better than working and publishing as an example. Like that's one differentiator between some of them and obviously having to be pragmatic about how you're choosing the realm that you're going into and whether or not you can afford to live in New York City on whatever the salary is for that job. But I would say main pros and cons, scale of the organization is one that comes to mind. So a really big organization with a lot of folks involved. To me, that's probably the biggest challenge to getting work approved that you feel like is a representation of your personal design tastes and what you feel like is most successful. It becomes a lot of kind of compromising. If you look at how an organization is built and all the people in their interests, the folks that are in marketing are going to have different interests than the folks that are more focused on the total sales of things. Like they're getting everybody to agree on work that's really like adventurous and different and original is quite challenging. So when I see studios or companies that put out work that's wow, this is really out of the ordinary and unexpected, my first thought is always it's amazing that they got the client to agree to that and they got everybody on board because it's easy to get everybody to agree to like an innocuous kind of well designed, but not anything out of the ordinary approach. But doing something that feels really different, I think is quite challenging to get everybody on the same page for that. So that's kind of the pros and cons. With a smaller team, I'll work on a book cover, and there's probably like four main people involved. There's obviously a sales team that'll look at stuff and say, hey, can you make like the title a little bit bigger? But other than that, it's mostly the agent, the author, the editor, and then the publisher. And then, the creative director is obviously setting direction and that type of stuff. But the team is very small. And so you know who you have to appease, their design tastes or their sensibilities versus a large organization. There's a lot of people involved.
Makes sense. And so in some of those situations where there's like tons and tons of stakeholders, for somebody who didn't come from a traditional design background, I'm curious throughout your career what your relationship has been with feedback and sort of how you've built your confidence in design.
Yeah, I think early on, probably negative feedback had a more of an impact on me, or like not negative feedback, but just kind of criticism or critique, saying, "Hey, I don't think this works. I think something else might work better," and not taking like at the time early on, I feel like I took that more personal versus now where I'm so detached from it. And it becomes a thing where you say, let's be as objective as possible about what's the brief, what's the objective, and then how does this design or this system solve that? And not necessarily taking it as a personal affront if somebody doesn't like something that I propose as, oh, I feel like this is the best solution. They have a different perspective and not feeling like I take that as a personal critique. Obviously, it would be different if you painted something and had a friend weigh in and they say, "Oh, I think this is trash." You'd be like, that's devastating." But for a client to not like something, at this point, it feels a lot more impersonal and not like anything that I'm going to take to heart. But for the most part, I really deal with feedback best when it comes from a standpoint of looking at the original brief and strategy and how does the design that I'm presenting address that. So if somebody comes back and says, yeah, I think based on the strategy that we've put together, I do feel like we're missing something in these areas, or it would be more effective, in terms of the choice of type or color or all those things. If it's an informed by a strategy, the feedback makes a lot more sense to me and is kind of easier to navigate. When you get feedback from stakeholders or folks that are involved in a project and it's like, I like purple, I like blue, I like a sans serif. It's harder to make sense of that in terms of the project and what feels most successful, because it feels a lot more personal. Like we don't need to, as a group, address everybody's personal taste. We need to do something that feels like the best solution for the brief.
Makes perfect sense. I love that. And so, along with having to sort of deal with the trials and tribulations of many stakeholders involved in some of these projects, I imagine that you weren't the only designer on some of these projects. And I'm curious, throughout your career working with many different designers in different capacities, I'm curious in your mind, what makes a good graphic designer?
Yeah, so I think, well, the easiest answer is taste, like just getting to the point where you've seen enough things and you've made enough things to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. So that kind of the nuance of design of there's not always one solution for something. There could be 10 different solutions, but one of them feels more appropriate and feels more refined. So I think being able to look at a full range of kind of options and then narrow in on why something feels best. And sometimes it's harder to articulate that. So I would say with really talented designers, you'll notice that the things that they're pointing out and the decisions they're making and the way they're thinking about it is just a lot more refined and considered than maybe a more junior designer who's saying, yeah, this just like looks good to me, but there's not that sense of it feeling like it's super intentional and every decision was really thought through and kind of labored over. So yeah, I would say the process of decision making, having a reason for every single thing that you do, and then it feeling like every aspect of the design is intentional is something you see with a lot of talented designers. If something is off kilter or looks slightly off, then they're doing that for a reason. It is intentional. And that kind of nuance of not doing something that's strange because you didn't realize that it wasn't just quite set right. There was a reason behind it. So yeah, I think that's something that you see across all great designers is an ability to defend every decision they made as intentional and having a reason that was tied back to whatever the goal is you're trying to accomplish.
Makes perfect sense. And so now that we have an understanding of what you think makes a great designer, I'm curious through all these roles you've had, where have you felt that you've been among the highest concentration of people with that level of taste and with that sort of shared mentality in mind?
Yeah, so aesthetically, not folks that I've worked with, but so do you know Order Design?
Hmm.
Yeah. So the work that they do, I was looking through case studies on their site the other day, and I'd seen a few on Instagram. They did like a brand system to update kind of Herman Miller's identity, and it looked beautiful. So I was looking through kind of all the elements that went into their case study, and it was just so thorough of like archival material and tying it back to the brand's like original kind of outlook and perspective on design. And that feeling like to me was the best representation of the approach I try and have, which is every single thing being tied back to a strategy or a purpose and maybe pulling in the heritage of a brand. So if it's something that's been around for years, like how can we get back to some of the things that this company was founded on and what makes it unique, instead of just like going with the times, kind of evolving to whatever the current trends are and making things feel like it'll last. You see a lot of rebrands out there and think to yourself, this will last for like 2 to 3 years, but then they're going to like rebrand again. And there's going to be a need for a new approach because this is so trendy and just of the time. So I think that kind of classic and timeless approach, And then at Collins, I've done one freelance project with them over, it was like 6 months or so, but over that time of just seeing how every decision that was being made there had a basis in the strategy and tied back to the original brief. It wasn't just designed for design's sake. I was really impressed by all of it having a real point of view and being intentional. So I'd say, yeah, a lot of talented folks that work at both of those places, amongst, a wide range of studios that have super talented people.
Cool. Yeah, two studios I really look up to, so I'm happy that you shouted them out. I also want to talk to you, Chris, about simplicity in design. I feel like touching on some of that timeless quality that you mentioned from some of the work that you look up to. I'm curious how you balance simplicity with sort of the aesthetic qualities.
Yeah, so from my standpoint, the thing that's always an uphill battle with kind of selling something that's very minimal or simple to a client and getting them to agree to it is that sense of, oh, I could have made this in 10 minutes. You see this all the time in like comment sections for like new brand systems or rebrands, etc. This idea that because something is minimal or simple, it doesn't take skill to build and it's not intentional. Like, oh, we this looks under designed. So fighting that kind of approach, but I think the main thing that it really comes through with a minimal and simple design system is that it doesn't feel like there's anything that's out of place. I like it feeling like every aspect that is within a composition or an ad or whatever has its purpose and has its place, and it's pulling a little bit more weight than it might traditionally. So if you have an ad that has an image, it has copy, it has maybe there's a UI element on it, and then there's a tagline. All of these things are putting some emphasis on a different aspect of the brand or conveying something. Versus if it's really minimal and there's one piece of type and there's one logo on there, like each of those things has to pull a bit more weight. And the need for that to, in the smallest way, be really refined and considered the way that the letter spacing looks, the way that the lettering is set, the way that the characteristics of the typeface, the background color, like all of those elements feeling like, okay, it had to be that. It feels so simple, but I can't imagine it being anything else. I get a lot of satisfaction out of instances like that where it doesn't feel like there's anything you could change. It just feels right, and there's very little noise there.
Makes sense. And I also, in that same vein, I want to ask you, when I was in design school recently, there's a lot of talk about sort of systems thinking. And I'm curious when you say that sort of you see these brands that are almost like creating these identities and these systems that you feel like are very sort of like trend oriented and you think won't stand the test of time. I'm curious, are there any qualities that aren't the ones that you already mentioned that you feel like can almost like have a future proofing quality to them?
Yeah, so what I had mentioned about tying things back to a company's history or things that they've used for a long time, I think that to me is the biggest way that brands can keep some sort of through line of everything that they've done that feels ownable and unique to them. And obviously, the term ownable in this day and age is really difficult because we're exposed to so many different ads, brands, everything. Like every aspect of your day, you're getting some exposure to design and a brand communicating something to you. So it's hard to feel like, okay, we own this and nobody else does, Coca-Cola being red and Target being red and Beats. And you go down the list of brands that share a color. Okay, so the color isn't going to be ownable. Is the type? Well, if you look at across all of the brands that you've seen, there's a ton of similarities in how they set type. And then lifestyle photography, has a very similar feel. So all of these elements, it doesn't feel like individually they can be ownable, but when you combine all of these things and have it tied back to where the company has been and the ethos that it started from, I think that's when you see things that feel timeless, that feel like they can really stick. When you see a lot of things like product photography that's shot the exact same way, you'll see a campaign from, and I'm not calling these out in particular, but you'll see like Uber Eats and Postmates and Panera Bread and what they all have a similar like kind of style of how they're lighting and shooting things for photography. And there is an element of that's kind of what's in vogue or that's trendy. It doesn't mean that it's bad or that it won't last because some of these brands could commit to that and stick with it as long as they like. But you see a lot of kind of flavor of the year or whatever is kind of in vogue at that moment being the basis for a lot of rebrands. And then some companies are rebranding like every 2 to 3 years. I mean, Burberry's a good example. They did a rebrand and went to like Sans for the logo, much more minimal and stark. And then 2 years later, it was like, oh, where we got a serif for the word mark, and now we have this like sweet looking logo that's very ornate and detailed, and we're going bolder with color. So you see a lot of that these days, but I think again with the Burberry work being an example, if it's tied back to a company's history and they're pulling in archival stuff and saying this is a stamp we used 70 years ago, all of those things help it feel less trendy and more authentic to whatever that company is.
Makes sense. Yeah, I feel like there is almost like the you have to fight the Pantone of the year sort of like pull,
Yeah.
you know? Well, I just want to say thank you, Chris, for sharing some of your wisdom. You're a designer who I truly look up to. So I just want to thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks, dude. Appreciate you having me.
Of course. And I want to close out. One of the purposes of hidden characters is to highlight some of the graphic designers who sometimes get overshadowed, but are the ones who are contributing to some of the work you see coming out from studios. So, in that sort of vein of giving recognition, are there any underrated graphic designers who you want to shout out or who you'd love to see on the show?
Yeah, it's tough. Underrated is tough because I'm not sure what makes somebody like there are people that are kind of a designer's designer. Like, yeah, they're not like super well known on Instagram or on any other, TikTok or whatever it is, but their work, like amongst other designers, everybody loves. So tough to say on the underrated front. I would say if I was just picking somebody who I personally feel like I've had the most positive experience working with, Ben Crick, I worked with him when he was a creative director at Collins on the project that we did. And I've never worked with somebody that it felt like every single piece of feedback or input that they gave did improve the work. I've worked with so many folks where, yeah, maybe like 70% of the input they give is making something better, but then the other 30% you're saying, oh, I think we might be going in the wrong direction here. This doesn't seem to be getting better with each round of revision. We're kind of like declining a little bit. But he's the first person that I've worked with where every single like comment and thought that he had for, hey, maybe try this or do this, or I think this would be more successful if we went this route. You're like working on it and you're saying, oh yeah, that actually really improved this. I like where we're headed. So I would say this that working with him, he's a super talented designer. He works at Apple now. And yeah, I feel like in terms of the underrated aspect, again, that's tough if I were to list a few other names because in my mind, they're not underrated. They do get a massive amount of praise amongst other designers as being super talented. But in the publishing world, I would say is that where I like fanboy the most because I'm not from that background. I kind of like weaseled my way into publishing with a few projects at first, and I still kind of feel like an outsider because I didn't go to art school. I don't have a traditional background. I've never worked in full time at a publishing house. But like everybody that works on the design teams at like FSG, Farrar, Straus and Giroux is a very popular publisher. Knopf, like some of these places, everybody that works there is so talented. So I would say any of the folks that work there, the New York Times Magazine design team, it's just absolutely ridiculous the quality of work that they do every single week. So yeah, I would say in kind of editorial and publishing, there's a million people I could list off that are amazing, but those are the areas I get most inspired by, and seeing their work kind of keeps me invigorated and wanting to try new stuff. It's kind of that feeling of you see something designed and you're like, damn it, I wish that I made that. And getting that feeling all the time from someone's work is, yeah, it just makes you want to like practice more, get better at something, or try new stuff.
Absolutely. I'm glad you named more than one, sharing the love. Is Ben he's the Australian one, right?
Yeah, he's Australian. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think I've come across some of his work before. Ben,
Yeah, his work is great.
if you're listening, Ben, I'd love to have you on the record, bring in like an Aussie twist to his hidden characters.
I love it.
But with that, Chris, I just want to say thank you again so much for sharing some thoughts, and I'm super happy to have you on.
Of course, it was great chatting with you, Jack.
Okay, take care, Chris.
See you, man.
Hey, I wanted to check in to say thank you for sticking to the end. I'm happy to get this first one in the books with Chris. I just finished editing the episode and I'm excited to put it up. And there's more on the way, so stay tuned for that. And the best way to keep in the loop is to subscribe. And if there's anybody you want to see featured, let me know in the comments. And generally, if you like it, engage with the content. And I look forward to seeing you in upcoming episodes. So see you then. Bye now.